Welcome to the Soar Podcast, the place for creative entrepreneurs with limitless dreams and unconventional stories who want to build healthier, happier, more profitable self-employed businesses. I'm your host, Ray Hyde Cornell. Get ready to soar. Welcome to the Soar Podcast. On today's episode, we have Lindsay McMahon. Lindsay, tell our listeners what it is you do.
Thanks for having me on the show, Ray. This is exciting. Glad to be here. So I run an education technology company. So we're an education media company for English learners, adults who are global professionals who are looking to do business in English, which is not necessarily their first language. And so we help them level up for the business world.
So are you helping people who English is a second language for them, and you're helping them kind of acclimate to the, I shouldn't say American market because English goes beyond America, but that kind of like dominantly North American market?
Yeah, exactly. So now I think of it more as kind of exactly as you said, a global language. So when I think of our listeners now in 2023, I think about preparing them for the global marketplace. But historically, it has been more geared to American English, but I'm liking that we're having this a bit of a pivot now to just global English.
Yeah, and that's so interesting because, and the other thing that I want to really dig into is you have a lot of expertise in podcasting, starting a podcast and being very successful in that. But I want to touch on the language bit a little bit because this is kind of one of my side passions. When I was in undergrad, I studied Italian, Spanish, French, German, Latin, and Greek. Like,
that's a lot of languages.
Languages. I'm just fascinated. Yes. And it's interesting, this whole dynamic around English, because some people think, oh, us ugly Americans, we always go to countries and expect them to speak our language. But I've found more and more, especially because I work with a team in Germany, and I'm also part of a group that meets where a lot of people are based in Finland. Mm-hmm. And the preference is actually to speak English because that's kind of becoming the common ground.
Right.
Is that something that you foresee being a trend into the future, or are there other languages like Mandarin, which I've heard is, very, what do you say? Like, it's very common. Yeah, exactly. What are you seeing in the linguistic trends around the world?
Yeah, I think right now, certainly it's English for sure. We'll see what happens in terms of the geopolitical shift, if there is a shift in kind of the strength of the dollar, world power, things like that. I think it does depend on geopolitics. But right now, we're definitely seeing English being the language. A lot of our students who are, adults, 20s, 30s, 40s, they've always been trying to learn it and they're continuing to learn it. It's kind of a lifelong project for them. It is the language of business currently. It could shift in 30 to 50 years potentially, but for the next 20, 25 years, 30 years, I think we're in it for English for sure.
Well, and it's also the language of technology. I mean, Google started out speaking English, and with all of this AI and Chat GPT stuff, it started out in English. So, I mean, that's kind of the starting ground for innovation.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see what happens in the longer run. But I think, for the foreseeable future, English is definitely the language to learn for sure.
That's so interesting. And I feel really bad for anybody who English is not their first language because it's a very difficult language to learn. My husband and I joke all the time. We'll say something and, if one of us mishears, we're like, can you imagine someone trying to learn English and trying to distinguish between these two words that we native English speakers are getting confused all the time?
Yeah. It's hard. It's humbling though, learning a new language. I just finished, didn't finish learning Arabic. I just went to Egypt and learned a little bit of Arabic just to negotiate with taxi drivers, do the basic things. And it just is humbling. So in a way, there's kind of a gift there because you get to see different aspects of life when we learn a new language, right? When we're only speaking our native language, we're kind of in our own zone and we miss a lot about the world.
Yeah. So, yeah. And I mean, speaking of language, I mean, we're on a language heavy platform right now, which is podcasting. And I want to get into that because I think The more that people can talk and share their expertise and do it in a way that's very conversational and colloquial, the more people are going to be able to better understand each other. And I think there's a lot that gets lost in translation with writing in particular. I work with a company based in Germany, and they're developing an app for the US market, and they're having me edit the translations of a lot of their app language because they're using words and I'm like, that's not the way that it would be said in
Yeah.
conversational, everyday language. And so what to you is the big value around podcasting in particular?
Yeah. So the big value of podcasting and why it's so different from blogging or writing in general is the intimacy that you have with your listeners, the connection,
Mm,
right? When I'm, my podcast, the podcast that I listen to every morning, they're right in my ears, right? And that is such a close connection. And so it's not just the words that they hear. It's the tone of voice. They can
mm,
almost hear who you are behind what you're saying. And so that's why it builds trust. It builds community. It builds a sense of belonging. If the podcaster has a vision, kind of meaning behind their work, it can be incredibly powerful, not just to launch and grow a business, but just to kind of make a difference in the world, to have an impact. So that's the
yeah.
difference, I think.
And you're right. There's so much more information that's translated when we can actually listen to someone. I mean, if I
Right.
think of a simple sentence like, the mailman is here, I could say it, "Ugh, the mailman is here, or the mailman is here." And you're getting so much more information. Like, am I annoyed or am I excited? Am I waiting for something? Is there anticipation? Which you don't get
Yes.
that if you just see the words on the page.
Oh, yeah. I think it kind of taps into how humans always loved storytelling. And it's not as much reading. We love reading, as a human race, of course, but hearing stories being told always added that extra layer, huddling around the campfire, listening to camp stories. There is something powerful there. And I think podcasting taps into that and brings it into the business world, which is incredible. We obviously love podcasting.
Yeah. And there have been so many more people moving into podcasting, starting their own podcast, businesses and individuals, people who are trying to monetize it, and people who are just doing it for a passion project. I mean, I
Yes.
think about content has always been king, but it was written content, blog content that made SEOs,
Right.
indexing bots happy for the longest time. And then it went from there into video. But I felt like the barrier to entry for video was so much higher than it is for podcasting. And once people realized that, especially during COVID, I feel like podcasting just exploded as this really popular platform, which on the one hand is a good thing because it means more people can get into it and start leveraging this platform. But on the other hand, it's a bad thing because how do you even, as a listener, choose which podcast to listen to? And as a
Right.
podcaster, how do you get your show listened to?
Yeah, I think in the long run, it's always a good thing for more people to be entering the space, for the podcasting ecosystem to be healthy and thriving and growing. We always need people to be starting new shows and feeling like they can. The RSS feed, which is essentially what makes podcasting unique, it's open. And what that means is when you start a YouTube channel, YouTube basically owns your content. They don't own the
Mm,
copyright on your content, but one day they can say, sorry, we're taking you down, or you can't monetize this, or you now have to pay us, and your channel's gone.
mm,
But podcasting, because we use an open RSS feed, you own your feed, you pay a company to host your files, and then you send your files out to Apple Podcasts, to Spotify, Castbox. There's thousands of podcast apps. There are a couple of big dogs like Apple, Spotify, but it's more free and open. And so the more people that can continue to start podcasts, the better. Let's keep it going this way and not have kind of gatekeepers.
What's the percentage, or what are you seeing in terms of a trend? Maybe we can't put a quantifiable percentage on it, but how many podcasts do you think actually survive? I mean, I know there's like some really big milestones, like 100 episodes, 200 episodes. I mean, when do people kind of start to peter out?
Yeah, that's the point. As you mentioned, a lot of people started, podcasts during the pandemic. I think a lot of them, there's a term for this in our world. It's called pod fade, the pod
Uh,
fade. It is really hard. It's hard to get past There are certain milestones. I feel like 20 might be one milestone for
Mm,
very beginners, and then 100 is another big one. Episode 100. It is hard because, yes, there's a lower barrier to entry. We don't need the lighting, we don't need the background, we don't need the fancy camera. But you realize that it's not just getting on a microphone and speaking, right? It's having a format, it's having, depending on how produced you want your show to be, it's a lot of work.
yeah.
And so a lot of people do pod fade, but those that have a vision, I keep coming back to this because it's really important. A reason you're podcasting that's hopefully deeper than your business. That's the key. We're at episode 2000 plus now. We just did episode 2000 at the end of May.
Did you say
Uh,
2000?
yes, I did.
Holy cow.
Yeah. So we've been around for a long time, since 2013, and we just keep going. We do 4 episodes a week. And that's how you get to that crazy number. Not that anyone should. I don't recommend it. But having a vision, having a reason you do it, and obviously having it fuel your business is the way to keep going, right? It's the consistency plan. So,
And that's the thing that I've heard from other podcast hosts is that, sorry, I'm just still baffled by this 2000 number. By the way, your episode number is 84. So that's where we are today with my podcast.
Okay.
So I've heard from other show hosts that, especially the ones who stick it out, they're like, I'm not seeing an ROI from this, but I'm just going to keep going. For some reason, something's telling me to keep going. And that's kind of where I am because I love the people who come on my show. I love the conversations we have. I love providing that free value to listeners. Yes. I think that's very underrated nowadays because so many people are like, oh, I have value, but you have to pay for it, know? And so I think it's just important to start getting ideas out there. But I've heard from a number of other people that they didn't start to see an ROI on their show until year 3 or 4. Is that something that you've seen as well, or is that more anecdotal?
Yeah, that's probably true. It just depends on how you define ROI, what you're selling. Yeah, it depends on what that number means for you. But in our case, we launched early, and so we had a little bit of an early mover advantage in 2013. We started monetizing after about 9 months to a year. We started selling our transcripts, and then we took on our first sponsor. Sponsorship was quite different from how it is now. But it was a good year of just 4 episodes a week. And again, we've never missed that number, right? We never just fail to publish. We just keep going. And that's what it took for a year of giving, and then finally starting to make a little money off of it, but it still wasn't enough for a full-time business for a couple of years, right? So this is a long haul game for sure.
Yeah. And it's something that, just speaking from personal experience, you have to really be passionate about because it's that time on your calendar that you're not getting paid for. And when a lot of people are running their own businesses or freelancing, they've got a side hustle and a W-2 job. They have to look at it in terms of, is this worth it to me? And so you really have to have that intrinsic reward.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree. But I think all businesses do have that period of time in which you just have to pay your dues. There's really no way around it.
Absolutely.
Whether it's a brick and mortar business, you're doing some form of marketing. So when it comes to podcasting, it might as well be something you enjoy. If you really enjoy it, what you said earlier, Ray, is something's just telling me to keep going. That's a really good sign. Right? I had that feeling too in 2013, 14, when my original co-host decided to leave and something was telling me, hey, there's something special here. This business has to continue. So if you hear that voice, follow it, I think.
Yeah. And you mentioned, there's a lot of different ways to monetize your podcast. The one I think people are most familiar with is selling ad space, basically allowing other companies to sponsor episodes, and then you insert a commercial somewhere along your podcast. But you mentioned something earlier that I thought was interesting, selling the transcripts of your podcast. What is that? And if I'm correct in my assumption of what that is, has that changed recently with this trend, I guess I can say, of all websites and all media online needing to be ADA compliant, meaning you have to have a transcript on there. Otherwise it may not be, able to be accessed by every member of the population.
For sure. So in terms of the ADA compliance, I don't know a ton of details about that. If that comes to an issue, we will certainly address that. But our market's a little bit different because our listeners are learning English as a second language. And so that is kind of a product. I mean, some of my competitors give them away for free. Some of them don't do it at all. There's always ways that our listeners could go and get the transcripts easily if they had the MP3 file, which they can find online for sure. Anyone can go and get that for free in many places, right? But, when you think about business, what business is packaging up something and making people's lives easier. And so when people sign up for our transcripts, there are actually two ways to do it. It's a recurring subscription is one option in which we package it all together. We edit it, make it look nice and perfect and easy to read, and then email it to them in a book of 4. It ends up being like a 20-page booklet curated for them, or they sign up for our app. We have an iOS and an Android app, and we built a special tool in the code, which actually gives them the transcript right there in front of them. It's just a custom coded app. And so they're able to see it and tap on words that they want to save to their list. So there's a few ways we do it, but I think business is about figuring out what your audience needs and creating value for them right there.
That is so smart. That's super smart. And what other ways have you seen shows monetize their podcasts outside of, selling ad commercials and things like that?
So a lot of people in my world, in my industry, do online courses. And that is the first or the second big thing that we did. Third big thing we did to monetize was sell online courses. And the more niche down you are, the better. We chose a niche in the test prep industry, and we have since expanded to other courses in fluency and business and things. So online courses is a great way to do it. We've done live events, iOS, Android apps. We have an Alexa skill, but we don't monetize that right now. And now we're doing more things along the lines of licensing. So B2B contracts. So talking with companies to license access to a course where they can then go and translate that course or sell that course on their own platform. So there are a lot of ways, but it starts with content creation. If I think about all of our revenue streams, it all starts with the podcast at the very top as a way to find leads, to convert leads, to build community, to get people excited about our unique vision. It all starts there.
Yeah. And that's what I was going to ask you is, did all of those monetization opportunities come from your podcast? Which sounds like the answer is yes.
Well, I would say that just because it's kind of my favorite channel, right? It's the one I put the most energy, the most heart into. We have a YouTube channel, we have a blog, we have Instagram, we have a TikTok. These are all secondary channels just because we don't love them as much.
I feel you there.
And so they just don't matter in my mind, but all the content is there, right? The content is going to YouTube in the same way that it's going to the podcast. But I just say it all started there because that's where the heart and soul of the business lives.
I want to get into more of you've been doing this a long time, 10 years now.
Yeah.
So I want to get into the nitty gritty of where you would recommend that someone starts if they're looking to either launch a podcast or grow their podcast and turn it into a more monetized opportunity. So we are going to take a super short commercial break and we'll be right back. Hey, this is Ray. When I started my freelance career way back in 2007, I wish I had access to a library of lessons I could go to whenever I hit one of those oh shit moments in my business. Now, after building 2 businesses of my own and helping hundreds of business owners create healthier, happier, more profitable businesses, I've created that library of burnout blocking tools that I wish I had back in the day. The Chiron Academy is your training ground to hone your skills and strengthen your business one area at a time. Inside, you'll get access to all of my courses, workshops, and business building events for one low monthly price. Rather than buying each workshop for $47 and each course for $297 or more, you get access to everything for just $47 a month. You can take all the workshops you want whenever you want, and with each one, you'll see your business leap forward. Save time, save money, save yourself the stress, and soar. I'll see you inside the Chiron Academy. Learn more at chironconsulting.us/academy. We are back with Lindsay McMahon. So Lindsay, you mentioned before that one of the foundational elements of a successful podcast is you have to have that vision, that mission, that driving purpose and why behind it. What is your reason for doing a podcast in particular?
Yeah. So I'll tell you our vision, our reason for teaching English as a second language, and then it kind of translates naturally into a podcast. Our vision is connection, not perfection. It's actually a trademarked phrase, but it's so much more than that. It's a value. And so all of our episodes, we try to bring the whole reason behind we're doing this back to human connection. If you listen to other podcasts in my industry, they're great. People work hard, but it is often a heavy focus on being correct and almost being perfect. Even if the teacher's not saying that, there's a certain stiffness, professionalism. It feels very academic. We take a very practical approach. And so we feel very strongly about that. A lot of that is based on my own experiences learning Spanish, traveling the world, learning Japanese, living in Japan, and feeling a little disconnected socially, right? And so wanting that human connection so badly. So now I want to show the world how to do it along with my co-hosts in English. So there's that, right? There's always got to be a vision behind not just why you podcast, but also your content, right? Your industry, what you're actually saying on your show. There has to be something there. And then podcasting is just the easiest way, the most natural way for me to get that message across. And I think for my co-hosts as well, I selected my team based on, their academic experience, their skills and degrees, but also their voices. They're very energetic. Michelle, one of my co-hosts on All Ears English, had been in radio. She has a radio voice. She's alive. She's lively. And so that's kind of why we podcast. It's just a natural fit.
How do you recommend that someone goes about figuring out what their purpose is? I mean, I know a lot of people, and I'm thinking about it, a half dozen in my head right now, who they're passionate about things, but is it enough to do a podcast? Because when you're talking about creating 2,000 episodes, that means that you need to have a lot to say about a topic.
Yeah. I think it's important that you've been out in your industry, right? Your content area, and you've kind of seen the gaps in the market a little bit. And so that's one element, right? You have a new take on things. You have a way you think something is not being done quite right, and you can do it better. And then it's especially important if your angle you can relate that back to your own experience or someone on your team. Something needs to go pretty deep, I think. Like I said, the way we relate is back to human connection. Everyone in the world wants human connection, whether they say they do or they don't, they do. And so this comes back to a very, very deep human need. I think we need to find a way to bring it back to those core human needs and pull that out and see, how do I feel about this? Do I relate to this? Because if not, you're going to run out of steam. It kind of has to be a very profound connection that you have to this way that you're presenting your content. Does that make sense?
Makes total sense.
Okay.
Absolutely. And speaking of human connection, I mean, I think one of the things that shows struggle with the most is building their listener base. So what do you recommend for someone who maybe they're just starting out, maybe they have a couple episodes and their listener base just isn't where they want it to be? How do you recommend that they go about building more connections and reaching more people?
Yeah. So we can talk about the tactics, and I can name a few things that really do work now in 2023 that we do all the time. But first, it does start with what we just talked about: having that vision, having a reason for doing what you're doing, the way you're doing it. You won't get all the tactics in the world won't make a difference until you have that level of connection with your content. So let's assume we have that, and then we can kind of move on to the strategies, the tactics. So one thing that works, obviously has always worked and still works, is guest posting. So going on other podcasts, right? And sometimes if you feel like it makes sense, inviting that podcaster on to your show. It doesn't have to be a direct swap. There's no, you owe me this. That's not the way it works. But podcasting is still a very collaborative environment. It was in 2013. I think our first 100 episodes had about 30 different guest interviews where we saw who was out there. We reached out. We said, hey, we have a new show. We're really excited. Do you want to come on our podcast? We didn't say, can I be on yours too? But many of them did lead to that eventually. You just build these connections organically. Plus, you want those connections, right? They're in your industry. These are people in your industry, probably podcasting on something related, or even better, kind of indirectly related, right? Something, kind of an edge of what you do. And so that would be one thing. going on other shows, having people on your show. Other things that work well are promo swaps. So if you're not going to do a whole guest appearance, you could reach out to someone in your industry and say, hey, I would like to record a promo for my show, or they could record it for you. Even better, it's a host read promo, and you just swap. So you would run an ad for their show, it's just free. Agree on a certain number of impressions. Depending on where you host your podcast, you can actually schedule an ad or a promo for a certain number of impressions. But if you're not on that kind of a host, you can just put it into the episode. It can just be baked in. You can just announce it. Don't worry about the number of impressions. So those are two things you could do. We'll just start with those are really good. Those are two really meaty suggestions right there. So,
well, and I think that's an interesting concept, is swapping based on impressions, because normally, I guess in my mind would go to, you would swap based on episodes. Like if I do a promo on 3 episodes, then you do a promo on 3 episodes. But what if my listener base is a quarter of what yours is? Then that's a disproportionate trade-off.
yeah, I mean, you have to kind of figure it out. You have to kind of get a sense of how big the other show is. In the beginning, I wouldn't obsess too much about numbers, especially if you're trying to get your show. You're not going to have a lot of numbers necessarily to talk about. And so I would just try to build that relationship and talk to the podcasters and say, I'm launching this new show. I would love for your listeners to know about it. Here's how it's a little different from your show, but here's how it makes sense for your listeners. It's business, it's negotiations, it's building relationships, right? Yeah.
And then the flip side of getting listeners is you have to have guests, or I guess you don't have to have guests. There's a lot of shows that just do solo recordings where the host is talking about something in particular. And I do that every 8 episodes. I do a solo episode teaching on some kind of business building philosophy or tactic. And so if someone does decide to go the guest route, I mean, there are tools like, we use Podmatch in particular. That's been a really great one. It's like, if you're not familiar with Podmatch, it's like Tinder for podcast guests and hosts, essentially. And then there are a lot of different services that are popping up where they will actually say, hey, if you want to be a guest on shows, give us your parameters. We're going to charge a flat fee and we're going to get you on X number of shows for that fee. Is there something else that's out there that might help people get guests on their show, or should they know something to be aware of on those ones that I mentioned, Podmatch and kind of like these done for you services?
Yeah, I think Podmatch is good. I've been on Podmatch for the past maybe 9 months or so. It's a nice way to see who else is out there, especially because for me nowadays, I'm looking to podcast more, potentially start a new show in the future about how to build a podcast. This doesn't exist yet, and it may never exist. We'll see. When you're starting a new show, it's a great way to get opportunities. So Podmatch is good. Podmatch.com. I think it's about $39 a month. I would recommend that at this point for your listeners to get started there. In terms of the more valet service, I've talked to a lot of these services at the conferences. I personally, the ones I've seen have been overpriced. I wouldn't pay for that. Instead, what I would do is I would probably hire a virtual assistant to do a lot of that work for me, and then, create a list of 300, or maybe there's not 300 out there, depending on your industry, 100 of the top shows that would be good, that would make sense. And then they could write the email for you, or you could write the email. I think those valet services are a little overpriced, especially because they may have a hard time understanding the nuances of your positioning and where it would make sense for you to appear and not appear.
And where would someone go? Because I feel like podcasting metrics are surprisingly elusive. It's difficult to find. How many subscribers does a show have? How many listeners? What's their, and there are a couple shows that I've run into that claim to be in the top 1 or 2%. And then you look at their reviews or their downloads, and it's just like, how are you making that connection? So how do people find out what the top shows are so that they can try to reach out to those?
Yeah, many shows are in the top 10% because when they do that percentage, it's taking all of the feeds that exist, and many of those feeds have 0 episodes or 1 episode. So that percentage number is not a great one to go by. These days, now charts are also kind of, what is a chart? What goes into it? But Chartable is where I go to see the top charts. So chartable.com, you can type in any number of categories. They also, I think Chartable also publishes like Apple Podcast charts. And so you can kind of see, like you can type in US for us, US education, language learning, right? And you would get the charts. Who's at the top of the chart? US, global reach, business. You'd get that chart, that kind of thing. Chartable is a good way to start. Or you could just go to, Spotify or Apple and type in certain keywords and see who comes up first. That person, if they're coming up for a lot of keywords, they're probably ranking, they're probably doing pretty well. And you can confirm, you could say, hey, what's your audience base like when you reach out to them?
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And so one of the things that I think people need to consider from the very start is if this is something that they can do long term, because as we've talked about, there are these milestones, and there are so many shows on the list that only have 0 to 10 episodes, and then it's crickets. You don't ever hear from them again. And yet there are some shows that, especially recently, I've been getting emails from shows saying, hey, we are no longer creating new content. We feel like we've talked this topic to death. We really appreciate you being a listener. We've really enjoyed doing the show, but it's coming to an end. Maybe we'll start something new in the future, but is there any value to doing that when you're at the beginning and you're thinking about your long-term strategy? Is it okay to say, okay, my goal is to hit 100 episodes, and then if I feel like I've talked about everything there is to say on this topic, I'll end it there and maybe go do something else? Or is this something where people should be aspiring to hit your numbers of 10 years on air, 2,000 plus episodes?
Yeah, I think it makes total sense to set a goal, right? That's completely fine. You don't need to reach 2000. We're kind of crazy. We just have this thing with consistency, which has helped us in the algorithms for sure, right? And it's helped us get big numbers and sponsors and all that good stuff, build a business, but not everyone needs to do that, right? I would set that number 100's good, really good. That's a really good run. And that will give you a good amount of time to think, do I have more to say here? Is there energy below what I'm saying? Do I care about this topic anymore? 100 is great. Maybe start and say 20 and then say, I'm going to have a little bit of a, consider this, and then keep going to 100 and then have that final decision. I think that's great, but give it a good run. Like give it a year, year and a half at least, because it's not this get rich quick thing. It's just not that way. I'm not sure if it ever was.
I agree. It's not the way to making millions. This is not, I'm going to make a podcast and then it's going to become a best listened, or I'm thinking about the analogy of a bestseller on the New York Times. It's not going to become that in the podcasting world. But I will also say, when I first started my show, my first 10 episodes are terrible. I am so nervous. I am so all over the place. I didn't know what I was doing. I had so many notes that I was just trying to figure out, how do I even start this thing at the very beginning? And now I feel so much more comfortable that I'm glad I pushed past that 20 mark and 50 mark, because the more you do it, the more you figure out who you are and what your purpose is and what your point is and what your strengths are and where you maybe need help and where you want to improve. So just don't give up too soon.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. We've said before, you need to have that purpose or that value, that vision. But, in our case, and it sounds like for you too, it came out through the podcasting, and that's totally okay too. You could start just with your content area, your topic, your industry. And then as you articulate these things on the show, you hear yourself saying certain things. Like our slogan, our trademark, connection, not perfection, came out on an episode as we were trying to explain our philosophy on learning English. And we were like, oh, that's it. Yes, that's brilliant. That's what we stand for. But if we hadn't been podcasting, it probably never would have come out.
Yeah.
So that's
that makes total sense. What about this is the last question I'll ask you on this, because there's so much nitty gritty details we can go into in the rabbit hole of best practices. And, one of the things that I think is great about podcasting is there is no right or wrong way. I have a client on the Cornell content marketing side who they do a podcast and it's heavily edited. Every pause, every flub is edited out. And that's their way of doing it. That's not my way. If I stumble through my words, if I say, if I have a long pause, if I lose my train of thought, I just say so. And then we keep going, because I want people to hear the human side of the conversations. I don't want to sound so perfectly polished. And so our show is actually pretty easy to produce, which lends well to our publishing frequency, which is once per week. But you do 4 per week. Is there kind of like a best practice or if you want this, then do this in terms of publishing frequency and episode duration?
For sure. So it's, it makes sense your style, right? That's why you're on episode 84. You're able to keep going fast, produce a lot because you're not necessarily kind of nitpicking every episode, taking out every we fall much more on that spectrum and even further on that spectrum. One thing I would say about the number of episodes, and this was a smart decision that we made early on. Originally, our plan was to publish 2 episodes a week at 30 minutes per episode. And after like a week of this, we started thinking and we thought, oh, what if we could publish 15 minutes per episode? And we knew that that would just provide more episodes. And what that does, it just means that you publish more often. And so you have more kind of followers at one time and you end up kind of on the good side of the algorithms. And we've just continued in that direction. So if it's between publishing a longer episode, but fewer episodes versus more episodes that are a little shorter, it depends on your industry. But for us, it works great to publish more episodes that are a little shorter. It takes the same amount of time to produce because we also, like I said, we don't do a ton of editing because we want to show real English conversation. So that works perfectly.
All of the flub ups, even from the Native American or Native English speakers.
It's true. Yeah. So
See,
it works great.
I totally just messed up right there and we're going to leave it in.
No one cares. It's fine. Keep going.
And I think this is where you really have to decide what you want your show to be like. So, I've been on a lot of others' shows and I was on other podcasts before I ever started mine. And what I noticed was when I was on the shows that were 10 minutes, 15 minutes, sometimes even 20 minutes, I felt like we had just started to get comfortable with one another, that there was so much more really in-depth, valuable conversation still left to be had.
Yes.
And that's why when I designed my show, I wanted to do slightly longer episodes. I'm not going anywhere near like Joe Rogan 3-4 hour length kind of things, but I feel like we really hit our stride, especially if you're getting to know your guest in the recording itself. Like this is our first time having a conversation. And I feel like we finally start to kind of understand each other by about that 15-20 minute mark. And so I don't want to cut it off there. I want to keep going. So you kind of have to think about what the experience you want for yourself as a host and for your guest and for your listener is and where that sweet spot is.
Yeah, that's a really fair point. There have been times especially when we do guest interviews, which we do sometimes. I try to bring new guests on the show, new accents right around the world, different professionals. And there have been times, often I ask people to come to the show with 3 key tips, and it's very succinct, very concrete. It keeps it within the 15 to 20 minute mark. But sometimes I'll get through that episode and I'll say, oh, I took the wrong approach that I would have gotten to if it had been more conversational and a little more spontaneous. Or I didn't have time to really get to the meat of this. I feel like I didn't do a proper service to the guest or the audience. This has happened. But you just have to weigh the pros and cons. Totally. I think the other side of it is leaving people wanting more is always good. It makes people addicted, right? When people want more of what you've got, they've got to wait till tomorrow for the next episode, and prep time too, right? So if you're doing a longer show, it does take more time to prepare. Whereas if it's short and simple and sweet, it just takes less time. So you have to think about your content and what you're trying to get across. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's one of those things where we can look to the market and be like, oh, okay, so most people like to have shorter episodes because they are listening while they're walking the dog or while they're on their commute or whatever the case may be. But ultimately, if you're going to be the one doing the show, hosting the show, creating the show, paying the money to produce the show, which by the way, podcasting is not free to create. You've got to buy the mic and buy the Libsyn or Buzzsprout, and then, luckily my podcast producer happens to be my husband. So I've got some free labor there, but most people don't. Yeah. So if you're going to take all that time, ultimately the show has to conform to what you want to do and how you shine best. And then you can factor in the market elements after that.
Yeah. I totally agree. It comes back to, again, you need a vision, you need a reason to be podcasting, and the format, meaning the time in which you're on the mic each time, has to fit you.
Yep. So. And on that perfect note, where can people check you out if they want to learn more, either about podcasting or about your English language platform?
Sure. Yeah. So since your listeners are listening to this podcast, they can go and hit the search bar and type in All Ears English Podcast. They'll see the yellow. We actually have 3 shows, but the biggest one is just All Ears English, the main show. They can hit follow, they can listen in, get a sense of our format and how we do it to get some kind of behind the scenes tips. And then if they're interested in starting their own podcast, I'm going to be doing some informal coaching and mentoring in the next year or so. They can check out my LinkedIn profile, Lindsay McMahon, All Ears English. That would get you to me, and reach out. And I'm happy to offer any help or advice if people are looking to get started. So
Amazing. And we will put all of those links in the show notes so that if you don't know how to spell Lindsay's last name, which
yes.
it's McMahon, if you want to type it in right now, but otherwise we will put that in the show notes so that you can find everything that she just listed. Thank you so much for being here, Lindsay.
Yeah, I enjoyed our conversation, Ray. Thank you.
Hey, Ray here again. Thanks for listening. If you liked this episode, please subscribe and rate us in your favorite podcasting platform. Want to be a guest on the show or know someone who has an amazing story of entrepreneurship? Apply on our website at chironconsulting.us/podcast.